Um, what a beautiful day in England it's been, Dan.
Yes.
What a lovely, beautiful day. Allotment update for everybody. I got sunflowers. They're like 9 fucking feet tall, and I thought they were going to be the tiny ones. All I'm saying. Manure and cover crops.
Sprung up out of nowhere.
Spring up out of nowhere. Yeah, I'm digging it. I'm very happy with my sunflowers.
Sorry, wait. What do you put that down to?
I put it down to manure,
Okay.
and I put it down to cover crops. Is what I put it down to.
Okay.
Yes,
Some
the holy
healthy soil.
trinity of 2 things. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I love this point of summer too. Just the it's high summer, but it's also starting to get glimpses of maybe summer is kind of on its way out. You know what I mean? Because the days are noticeably a little bit shorter. It is what it is. It's just nice. I mean, also for the first entire half of summer here, we just didn't have summer, and now it's actually summer, and now it's going away. What are you gonna do? I love it. Early August. It's very nice. It's very, very nice.
Well, this is the thing that I've been waiting for whilst it slowly wanes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, it slowly disappears.
Yes. The fleetingness of the English summer. Great.
Yeah. English summers are very good. I will say. I like you always got to be on your toes about it raining, too. About it just torrentially raining. Because today, I don't know where it just poured with rain, 0% chance. Love it. What are you gonna do for 3 minutes?
Went for a swim today, which was very nice. I just
in the sea.
In the sea. In the sea, no less, which I never seem to do. I move to the seaside and then I never go in the sea. Who knows? Anyway, it was cold. It was nice.
Are you in a feces dumping zone of the English coast?
From time to periodic.
Periodic.
It's not chronic. It's intermittent.
Okay, that's good. That's better than a lot of places.
Yeah. It was a bit murky today, but it's fine.
You never know. Never know. Yeah. The beach I tend to go to is generally right where the Thames just dumps out all of its shit. So, you're getting it twice there. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Speaking of English shit, Dan, we were talking before the show. I was having a bit of a cathartic rant about the ongoing racist riots, fascist protests, whatever you're going to call them, the spate of things that have been going on around the UK, specifically England at the moment, popping up everywhere. We got one in my neck of the woods here tomorrow, and everyone's trying to figure out what to do. All these things, do we counter protest? Do we show up? We just kick the shit out of them? What do we do? Do we just ignore it completely? Figured we should probably talk about it here just for a second. I mean, we were also saying, I don't know how much there is to actually say about it. You were saying that this stuff is dangerously close to just outright pogroms, right? So we wanted to give it at least a little bit of some shrift. And the only thing that I'll say, the only thing that strikes me about all of this shit is just how farcically, mind-numbingly stupid it all is. Other than the obvious stupid bullshit that goes along with every racist movement or whatever, all of this stupid bullshit about immigrants. Other than that, what seems to have happened in all of the towns and cities that these are happening in is that some knuckle dragging, mouth breathing moron Googled X town and then the word immigration right after it and was first result, that's where we're going to have our protest. So there are all these rumors about them having protests at old folks' homes that have nothing to do with these things. The one around me, it's a lawyer's office who really doesn't have anything to do with these things. And it's just it's real first is tragedy, second time is farce. But that doesn't make it any less scary. So I think that's all I got to say about it, because it is frightening to see.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. It's shocking. I mean, it's not. I would say I'm never shocked when this aspect of sort of English, in particular English society, is revealed. I feel like I grew up around it to some extent. There is this. No matter how much we might imagine that society and societal norms have developed and grown, and we've sort of moved away from just very base ethno-nationalist racism. It's never far away, and it's very easily. It seems to be very easily aroused. I say easily aroused, right? Obviously, everything has been said, and there's nothing new to be said really about where these tendencies have come from, and I guess the sort of intersection of the sort of economic and the ideological and the narratives that have been spun, and what's interesting to me from a political standpoint is I mean, I guess the thing, I mean, other than what you were saying, like the seemingly like just outright how similar they seem to just being so close they are to being outright pogroms, right? Like there is a real murderous intent in some of these, which is just terrifying, and I don't really know how to respond to it other than that. And but also from a political standpoint, the sort of political thinking and the messaging is quite interesting, particularly the extent to which they are like sort of like pseudo or entertain anti-constitutional elements. You know, like there is, I mean, the apathy toward the police. I think imagines the current police force to be like agents of a corrupt system. It's a slippage that I've never really seen manifest in politics in front of my eyes, whereby the right wing of politics slips from being having a law and order politics, having a sort of like a constitutional politics, if we put it like that. It's in defense of law and order, and it's in defense of sort of like capitalist political norms. And it's sort of now these protests have strayed off the other end of that into being in some ways anti-police, in some ways anti-state. Now, obviously, like they're not anti-constitutional in the way that a radical left might be. They want a reconstitution of a political, I guess, a reconstitution of the state's repressive apparatus, a redeployment of state violence toward people that they recognize as being other somehow like malign elements in society. And there's it'd be interesting to see the degree to which that strays from being one which is targeting people of ethnic and racial minorities, migrants, people perceived to be like quote unquote not British, and the degree to which that extends from that point toward one which targets politicians and state agents, police forces, and starts to paint those elements of British society and British sort of constitutional life in a similar vein. I mean, that's the scary direction. That's the slip. I mean, like, I've never been one to brandish things as being fascist, but I mean, that's the slip into at least the sort of like authoritarian nature of fascism as it has existed in the past, and it seems emergent in this politics.
There are two people inside of us at all times. There's the one that labels everything fascist, and there's the one that's like, actually. And both of these people seem to be converging at the moment, inside of me at least. And it's like, oh, maybe I'm actually calling something fascist for once, and it is actually fascist. Two things I'd say is, one is that, and I was talking to you about this beforehand, when you talk about people being perceived as non-British, that's just so empty. You know what I mean? This ideology of Britishness, right? Because I was saying this to you, like, knuckleheads at the pub every now and then they'll be talking to will spout this bullshit to me. And it's like, well, you know, I'm an immigrant. And they'll be like, yeah, but you know, and it's like, well, I do know. I know exactly what you're talking about. So it's like, you know,
You've made it, Jack. You're actually British now.
Oh, God. But it's like, all I'm saying is that this idea of these in-groups and out-groups that fascists, racists, other morons make, they shift and they vacillate. And the scary thing is that, you know, one of these days it is going to be socialist, it's going to be communist, anarchist, whatever. I mean, people already moan about Antifa, right? Like, I remember my university at one point when a bunch of fascists, you know, came together and the anti-fascist student club showed up to like make them stop doing fascist things, the university was like, well, you should both stop, because the only thing worse than being a fascist is being anti-fascist. You know what I mean? So that shit's already here. And the only other thing I'll say too is just like, I completely forget what it was going to be. It just this idea of like populism as well. Like I'm not sure. I think that there's always been an element of right-wing populism that has been relatively anti-constitutional to a certain extent. It's kind of one of the reasons I'm always a bit uncomfortable at like Marxist Republicans always being, of the mind that the slogan that we need to get to people is down with the Constitution, right? Because it's like, okay, I understand where that's coming from. And maybe that is a good way of talking to certain people, but that's been being done for a very long time, similar things like that. It's just that it's done in the vein of, make it better, make it perfect, make the constitutional order what it used to be at this point in time that never actually existed, more authoritarian, more stuff like this. So I think maybe just because I grew up in like an American context, I'm more used to seeing stuff like that as a kind of typical populist playbook, kind of, on one hand supporting cops, but then on the other hand throwing bricks at them, when you want to go hassle migrants or something. So I don't know. We'll see. It's grim. It's very, very grim. And just I am surprised at the fact that these are just everywhere. I expected them to be in all the major cities and whatever, but like they are just kind of everywhere at the moment. They're attracting loads of people. And the interesting thing too is that the politicians don't seem to be involved in so much as they're maybe just playing catch up. Like obviously a lot of, Nigel Farage and all of these people are like part of this, but it's like I was at the supermarket the other day and the Daily Mail had a headline that was like, gone too far. Who are these violent thugs in our streets? Who could have egged them on? And it's like, yeah, wow, who could have possibly egged them on? And it's interesting because now we're just kind of seeing maybe it's more like lesser known, not politician types that are actually leading these things. Because the only reason I knew about the one around here is because people have been sending around screenshots of a WhatsApp group that all these people are using, right? So, yeah, I don't know. What are you going to do? These things are not going anywhere good, especially not when more and more immigrants are going to need help. So what are you going to do? I think we will have more to say on this, Dan, when we talk about authoritarian personality types, perhaps, and people that like being told what to do in today's reading. But yeah, anything else, any closing thoughts, or should we just get on with it?
No. Let's move on.
Yeah, we'll put a timestamp for people that didn't want to listen to that. Okay. As we always do after we finish a book, Dan and I read something relatively simple. We read two essays by, I was going to say friend of the show, not friend of the show, because we've actually never read him before, Anton Pannekoek. One of them was Society and Mind in Marxian Philosophy, and the other one was, shuffle my papers, Marxism and Psychology, written in 1937 and 1938, retrospectively. God, that's a grim moment. And they're interesting. They were good. They're very... I think we're probably going to wind up having more to say, as you were saying, about the psychology essay, just because it's a bit more, not interesting, but like it's some ground we haven't covered before. Meaty. Some meat on the bones. But maybe we take the first one first. Do you have any opening thoughts? It's funny because this is kind of counterintuitive. We were like, let's read Anton Pannekoek because he was discussed in, not on his own merits, because we were like, he was in State and Revolution in the last bit. So yeah, thank you, Lennon. We read some Pannekoek.
Yeah, I mean, this is a initial foray and not really representative of his, well, maybe it is representative of his thinking in some respects, as he was like more of an intellectual, I suppose. Famous council communist and astronomer, I believe. I mean, we could have just read all the essays on the discovery of Neptune or whatever.
That would have been sick.
Yeah. Next time. But yeah, I mean, I found these very engaging. It's interesting you say about them being written at the end of the 30s. I'm thinking now particularly of the essay on Marxism and psychology, because there were points in that when I was very fearful that it was going to go in a direction that was very dated, and as things from that time period tend to be, like that very extreme political moment. But I think there was a lot of universal takeaways from it, quite a lot of interesting things. It's quite a nice introduction to a debate around the intersection of Marxism and psychoanalysis. But you wanted to talk about the first essay a little bit first, which I found very engaging. I found it quite a sort of like maybe a sort of some. This is I don't mean this in a derogatory way, like a somewhat standard exposition of like materialism versus idealism, but one which didn't paint a stark contrast between the two because it was focused so much on the history element of historical materialism. It was far more interested in the historical development of ideas and how they linger in the human mind and how there is a sort of constant feedback between developments in the material basis of society. But when we say material, we shouldn't get locked into this idea of, okay, this means machines and technology and very overt sort of like social norms for organizing an economy. But also there is a historical development to the world of human thoughts and ideas and belief systems. And even in those circumstances where what we actually feel like we're dealing with is something purely in the realm of ideas, there is always like a historical material explanation of the development of that and how they rise in correlation with their historical significance to the modes of production, and then how they sort of tail off as their significance wanes, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always good every now and then to read something like this and just be kind of reminded of a lot of the basics, because I think in a lot of Marxist circles, you do every once in a while come to this belief that a lot of people have that Marx's materialism is basically positivism, right? It's basically just like, well, he's talking about the material things that you can see and touch and feel, and that's it, right? And then it's like, well, what about production relations? It's like, don't worry about that. And I think this is a really, really great introductory essay to kind of push back on that. Because one of the things you always hear is that Marx turned Hegel on his head, right? That Marx was like, oh, it's not the ideas that interpret things and that, build the world around us. It's the actual material things that build the world around us and that develop our ideas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Pannekoek here does a really good job of being like dialectical or whatever, and really understanding that Marx's materialism is much more, it's interconnected with society and belief and material factors and nature, but it puts the primacy on the society that one exists within, right? And I was just really impressed with the way that he was able to do this. He kind of like creates a little feedback loop where he talks about, society determines the ideas of people, which determines the actions that they have, which then, determines the society that people live within. And it was just very good. It was just very, very good. A nice, simple way of kind of getting past that simple materialism. And again, like, just to speak to what you were saying about ideology, he kind of mentions that at first, like, people will think that, for example, something like a belief in God or a belief system is ideology that you can simply just do away with, that you can ignore when you're studying history because it's not material, right? And these kind of like airy-fairy ideas don't actually determine the real events of real human history, right? And he's basically saying that when Marx uses the word observable when he talks about materialism, that he includes things like ideas, right? And idealism and belief, because belief very clearly has an observable effect on people's behavior. If you really wanted to get into it, it might be just incredibly difficult to try and understand the way that this like 3 or 4 pronged like feedback loop works with society, nature, ideology, the material world, society, all of these different things, right? But of course, he does always come back to the idea that Marx puts the primacy on social relations. And yeah, I think just for that, I think it was worth reading. It was nice and short. I think if any of your like philosophy friends are misconstruing Marx, you can just send them this and be like, you fools. But yeah, I enjoyed it. He's a very good writer too. It's very, very clear.
Yeah. In some ways, a good follow on from reading Rubin, actually, in the sense that like what's being explained here really is the nature of the distinction between Marx and the other sort of like young Hegelian philosophers who developed the materialism, but as you say, like a materialism which is purely interested in material objects in the world. And basically all Marx is doing is saying, well, no, social relations are a material thing as well, and just because they appear as, just because they're upheld through constant reinvestment of human energy in their upkeep, like various social relations between human beings only continue to exist because we choose to continue doing them. That doesn't mean that they're an invention of human minds per se, but the conditions of human existence living under a mode of production, which is itself a material object, I guess.
And yeah, and it's the reverse of kind of how people talk about. You'll hear some like progressives be like, man, what is money, man? Like, it's not even real. And it's like, well, money actually is very real because it hides and masks a very real social relationship between people, right? It's a kind of the reverse of that, right? It's like, it's interesting. It was a very clear explication of the interconnectedness of ideology and all of these different things, and a much less vulgar reading of Marx. The last thing that he talks about is tradition in a really interesting way, and I think that this will lead us nicely onto the second essay on psychology. He basically says that there are two sources of ideas in society. One is ideas that come from the present, and the other is, the thing that weighs on people like a ghost or an Alp or whatever, which is tradition and ideas from the past. And he ends this on a really positive note, especially writing this in 1937 or whatever he wrote it, in the mass defeat of the workers' movement worldwide, where he was like, tradition is always regressive to a society, right? Because it's these old ways of doing things that are attempting to grapple onto an ever-changing society, and it's attempting to kind of take things back to where they once were, or as we were talking about earlier, where they never actually were. People just think that they were. And society inevitably needs struggle, whether that's struggle in the part of the bourgeoisie or any other class or the workers, right? To kind of force these things into existence. This kind of leads him into an argument with someone named Stamler over the nature of the state and the nature of law as it relates to the economic-based mode of production. But basically, he comes away from it very positive, and he says, because it's not so much because this has always been the way that it's been, it's more so because society needs struggle to change. You can expect tradition to always lose. I suppose maybe you could put an insert thing about the common ruin of the contending classes as well. It was very nice for me to read this and be like, oh, tradition will always lose. That's very nice. And a very interesting, maybe brave thing for him to say in 1937.
Yeah. I was just about to say it's like a classic piece of like left com optimism, but I guess not all of the big thinkers of the left communist tradition end up in a place of optimism. So but
would have been very funny if he was just like, anyway, the workers' movement's dead. We're fucked.
I'm going to the land.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a bit. I was a little bit like, I don't know, or like, I don't know. It is that kind of left com optimism, maybe to a bad extent. And maybe this is just historical hindsight on my part, but it's also like, yeah, or tradition will eventually lose after it slaughters 6 million innocent people and like untold tens of millions other in like a massive war. You know what I mean? Obviously, he didn't know that was coming, but he certainly knew that fascism was a thing. And so it's like, don't worry about it, guys. Tradition will lose after it like tries to kill everybody else on the planet.
We shouldn't get too excited at the idea of the contradictions of society becoming revealed and evident, because the revelation that comes with that can be an incredibly destructive process,
Yeah. Well, a year later, Dan, our guy Pannekoek sets his worthy pen on paper once again to hassle the psychoanalysts. Before we get into this, I think maybe you introduce this one, because I'm just going to say I've always really struggled with a lot of psychology, psychoanalysis stuff. I find people that talk about psychoanalysis oftentimes very pretentious. If they bring up Lacan, my brain just kind of shuts off, and it's just like, oh yeah, wow, good for you for reading Lacan. Aren't you cool, man? Most of my knowledge of psychoanalysis thus comes from Adam Curtis movies. And so, once again, this was a very good introduction to the debates of his time, which I suppose still exist. I'd be interested to know what you think about that, how relevant these are to today's thinking around psychoanalysis, and specifically he's trying to talk about, are the psychoanalytic criticisms of Marxism valid? Which one supports the other? Is psychoanalysis useful to Marxism? Is Marxism useful to psychoanalysis? He kind of starts it by being like, I'm going to talk about the defeat of the workers' movement. And then he never brings it up again and writes about something completely different. But for the most part, I really enjoyed this.
I enjoyed it as well. Now, I don't claim to be any expert on psychoanalysis, although maybe of the two of us, I'm closer to being that. But you know, it's all incredibly relative. I mean, I've definitely in the past aimed my sights at that level of pretension, to be the person who understands psychoanalysis,
the person at the party.
But I've also always found it very uncomfortable when theories that are designed to explain sort of the development of a singular human being's psychological traits, I suppose, are converted into a language for the discussion of mass psychology, I guess. Now, I guess it stands to reason that we potentially all undergo the same process, and therefore there is a translation of those ideas, I suppose. But I don't know from where that discomfort comes, but I've never particularly enjoyed it. I feel like similarly to Marxism, like psychoanalysis lurches from one split to the other. So, and there are always some people that continue to hold the ideas of the group which is split from. So when you say, well, how relevant are these ideas, I'm sure there are like still stalwart classical Freudians in the world, you know. This is there's a sketch of psychoanalysis in here which which my limited understanding of psychoanalysis recognizes, and it's all the things that I always found quite fascinating about psychoanalysis, particularly psychoanalysis as developed by Lacan, I suppose, but like the general idea of sort of an infant human being sort of like released into the social world without any with really only a very base set of needs, and through a process of socialization learns how to get those needs met. And I mean that's a I guess a fairly standard definition of human sort of the human developmental process. I guess the psychoanalytic caveat to that is that process is a particularly fraught one, which results in a huge number of sort of repressed beliefs and ideas that are become constitutive of a underlying sort of set of motivations and drives which define a human character without them being necessarily obvious to that human being, I guess. Yeah, I guess to wheel back a little bit from that, like he does he begins this essay from the very sort of obvious point, like he's writing at the end of the 30s. At least the discussion that he's engaging with here is the sort of broader debate around, okay, what's happened to the revolutionary drive and desires of the working class? In another framing, you could say, why has the working class failed to do the thing that we intended it to do? You know, like we gave it this historic mission, you know, to liberate all of humanity, and it's seemingly failed in that task. Now,
can I just say a few things on that? Just like whenever that question gets posed, I'm always very suspicious because it's like, on one hand, this comes down to, I think, an issue that a lot of Marxists have, which is, as you were saying, why isn't the working class done the thing that I want it to do? But there are scientific reasons for expecting that to happen, so that doesn't bug me too much. But it's like, why hasn't the proletariat revolted against the state? Why hasn't the proletariat overthrown capitalism and done communism or whatever? I feel like there's a very, very simple answer to that, and it's because revolution is, like we've spoken about this before. It's not this great thing that we all like to think that it is, where people enter the czar's palace and they look up and they go, "Wow, all of this is ours now, and everything's great and it's all easy." They're really violent. They're really horrible. A lot of people die. There's something to be avoided at all costs. I say that as like a revolutionary Marxist, right? And it's like that simple question can be answered by looking at when people actually rebel, because it's not, people don't rebel when they lose elections. People don't rebel when they're even in line to get bread, right? They rebel when the bread's gone, right? When they absolutely 100% have to. And I mean, like, obviously I can see, as this question is being raised now, and I think is obviously something that's very worthwhile in questioning, as it was in Pannekoek's time, why are so many working class people drawn to these ideologies of fascism? That I think is a real worthwhile question. But I think the question of why haven't they done what I want them to do is like, it's very easily answered, I think. And it is just as simple as people want to act in their own best interests, I feel like. And of course we can say he specifically gets around this by saying, why haven't they acted in their economic self-interest? And it's like, because their bodily biological self-interest is to not act in that self-interest. You know what I mean? So I don't know. That's he started the essay by saying that, and I was just a little bit like, it's like when social democrats or Leninists or whatever are always like, why hasn't the workers' movement been built? Why hasn't this happened? It's like, people are acting in their self-interests. You know what I mean? We can pretend that this high-minded thing is a self-interest, and it is, obviously, but like,
I mean, really, yeah, I think he agrees with you. I think that really what he's setting up here is a very long explanation of what the intersection of Marxism and psychoanalysis looks like.
Yeah.
And he
it's because
he makes an argument which I'm not sure I fully understand, but he just seems to think they're two fundamentally incompatible things. I think
maybe. I didn't get that
was
sense.
my understanding.
I think
not that he doesn't he's quite scientific about it, and he's sort of like, although he acknowledges he's not in a position to fully refute, that's not the context of this, the intent of this essay. He seems to have a respect for the science of psychoanalysis, I think
he just says that, like, without Marxism it's nothing, and also like you can kind of just explain a lot of this with Marxism, which is really funny. He's kind of like, it's like an addendum to Marxism. But what I would say is you're right, because what he is actually doing is, in a roundabout way, and this is kind of why I was like, he starts talking about one thing and then goes on to talk about something completely different, is because he starts by being like, why haven't the workers done this? But clearly what he's actually doing is engaging with the psychoanalytic explanation for why the workers haven't acted, which, you're right, he doesn't necessarily really agree with. Yeah.
I feel like the one piece of this, like, well, there's a few pieces of his explanation of what his understanding of psychoanalysis is, or rather what his understanding of the various aspects of psychoanalytic theory as they pertain, because it's a very convoluted sentence, as they pertain to their relevance to Marxism, kind of thing. So he's explaining psychoanalysis as he understands it, with a view to explaining why there's a potential overlap or a relevance to some questions that are being asked by Marxists about the psychology of human beings in the working class, and how we can understand their motivations, revolutionary or otherwise. The first one that I wanted to mention was this sort of distinction between the sort of reality principle and the desire principle, right? Like, and I think it's this idea as I've come away from reading this essay. I think it's this idea which he is drawing on later on when he for my reading anyway, seems to be inferring that there's like a sort of general incompatibility between the two. But he seems to be like, in this distinction, like reality principle, desire principle, like the reality principle pertains to like what I was saying before, the very basic meeting of needs, and those things kind of they are needs that have to be met in one way or other. They are eventually attained, or like the human being dies, they don't get their basic needs met, whereas the sort of like the world of desire is entirely locked up in the sort of the human unconscious, all of the sort of like psychological edifice that's built above or is built around a human being's understanding of how they should go about getting their needs met. And contrary to the reality principle's requirement to actually fulfill its needs, the sort of desire principle doesn't necessarily have to get its needs met, or they are sort of endlessly postponed and perturbed. I think sublated is the right word, through this process of fantasy, right? Like there are the human unconscious is constructed of fantasy relationships with the real world that sort of like suppress the unconscious desires, I guess.
Which he does mention is rife on the left, right? And I find that a particularly like astute point when he talks about cults of personality.
Yeah.
He very briefly drops this where he's like, a lot of people just kind of want to be told what to do by a big leader. I mean, he's like not looking at anybody.
Well, this is the other part of the sort of Freudian terminology which he incorporates into his discussion, is the idea of the superego, right? And this process whereby human beings develop some kind of sort of like moral understanding, but one which is like almost connected to an arbitrary affiliation to a position of authority, kind of thing. In sort of psychoanalytic language, this is sort of like usually tied to like the position of the father, whether like metaphorically or really, I guess, supplants in people a as I say, like a particular attitude toward authority. Now, as you alluded to before, maybe this is the point where we could talk about like revolutionary personalities as opposed to authoritarian personalities. And as you say, like it's just as prevalent on the left that a sort of like a particular type of person that has a particular like I don't know, fetish for authority would find sort of like the cult-like aspects of left politics to be appealing in that respect, I guess.
Yeah. This is interesting. I do like how he framed the idea of the two personality types as being like, insofar as you can divide people into two personality types, to kind of just say, if we can actually do this, here's kind of what is being said. And I actually really appreciated it. I appreciate it because I mean, this is a distinct split that you do see in personality types, as binary as I suppose it is to claim that there are two and whatever, blah, 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 blah. It is interesting to be like, there are people that kind of have an affection for power and I suppose like disgust maybe, or at least a like distaste for the suffering. And then there are the people that have a sympathy for the suffering and a distaste for authority and kind of whatever incarnation that is, whether it's a principal or a politician or a cop or whatever, right? And the interesting thing about the authoritarian personality type, whatever it is just this idea of like, what does he say? Suffering without complaint. I found that really interesting. This idea that when you come across these people, they're just either they'll just throw their hands up and say, this is the way the world is, or they'll just be honest and be like, this is what daddy government or daddy capitalist like wants us to do. So we're going to do it. You know what I mean? And it's interesting. And I mean, maybe part of that goes part of the way to explain why so many working class people are wrapped up in fascist politics these days, anti-immigrant politics. At the very least, it makes it more comfortable. because you could also use historical materialism to explain a lot of this stuff. But again, we have to remember that when we talk about historical materialism, we're talking in aggregates, we're talking in trends, we're talking in laws that assert themselves over time. It can be a bit trickier to try and be like, here's why this person thinks like this. Here's why your uncle thinks like this, or why your cousin thinks like this. And I can see why people are attracted to this dual personality type thing as a way to kind of explain why it is that your cousin just wants to be told what to do. You know what I mean? Or why they're still able to, you know, engage themselves in a seeming grassroots movement where they're seemingly saving their country when it's clearly just organized by some of the most disgusting like city traders you've ever heard or you've ever seen. But yeah, no, I thought it was interesting.
I mean,
how much stock do you put in this stuff?
I mean, as a general like, I mean, I don't necessarily need to have like personality types to like fit people into, you know. But that said, like, I do feel like you clearly experience people in the world who, I would phrase it this way, I suppose. Like, I feel like there are people who have had reliable authority figures in their life, and as a result of that, are generally, I think, trusting of authority. And I would probably put myself in that category, actually. Like, I might, if these are the two traits that exist, there are aspects of my own personality I would recognize as being in the sort of like authoritarian camp, you know.
This is why you play the good guys in Warhammer, and why you are like,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
It's interesting though, because I feel like it can also manifest.
You do meet people who are like just like rabidly anti-authoritarian, like almost to their detriment, as a sort of like reflex reaction kind of thing. I mean, it's probably more of a spectrum than it is a binary, but like,
sure, yeah.
I mean, I think I put stock in that people have a learnt reaction, a learnt experience of an experience of engaging authority, which sets them up with a particular set of like instinctive reactions to various circumstances.
Yeah, and the idea too, I also wonder if this kind of authoritarian personality type, because I've always kind of assumed it almost manifests itself from the opposite experience that you're describing, where it's like never had any kind of like level-headed authority type in their lives, or resent certain figures in their lives that represented that. And then that kind of warps itself into being like always looking for someone that can tell them what to do. You know what I mean? I think maybe that's the one you want to be a little bit more on the lookout for, on the little bit of like, whoa, what's going on here type of thing. But also, like, as you say, there are so many other things going on. The interesting thing that I really don't know anything about is this idea that these things manifest themselves in the first 5 years of a person's life. I find that really interesting. I don't know. Again, I don't know anything about it, so I don't know how much stock to put into it. I do think it's so funny whenever a theory perfectly matches somebody's ideology. It's like, and then there's the good personality type, the revolutionary personality type. It's like, is it really called the revolutionary personality type?
No, I mean, this is definitely his language. For sure.
Yeah, the good one, the one that will lead the other workers and abolish. Okay, so this is what gets into the kind of interesting stuff where he's like, maybe there is a bit of a crossover here, because he starts talking about how certain maybe more lefty psychoanalytic people will say that, you know, he talks about Eric Fromm a little bit, who's I'm interested in his newsletter. I'd like to subscribe, as basically saying that Freud was incorrect to say that it was the biological helplessness of the child that allows for this kind of implementation of, I don't know if you'd use the term superego, or at least these ideas of authority into a person's life in their first several years. It's not that it's, you know, they're biologically weak children, and so they're able to be dominated by their father, right? It's not so much that. Fromm kind of turns it on its head a little bit and says that actually the determining factor for authority development, or at least your ideas about authority, are the kind of social helplessness of the adult. And this is kind of the thing I suppose that Pannekoek is interested in, because he's like, yeah, that puts the emphasis where it should be. And then you kind of realize what you should be studying instead of just psychoanalysis, because it's like he equates the social helplessness that adults feel as a conduit for the anarchy of society under capitalism as a conduit for the anarchy of the market, for planlessness, for everybody just being out for themselves. That kind of manifests itself in this ideological, I can't think of the second word. Ideological, what's the Althusarian thing? Ideological something apparatus?
Ideological state apparatus?
Repressive.
Yeah,
Whatever. That thing. It's the way in which the family is this unit of social reproduction, both literally, but then also ideologically, right? Because Fromm, I suppose, would say that it is, again, this social helplessness, that it asserts itself into the biological helplessness of the kid. And that's where the kid's kind of like, ideas on capitalism and what society should be, I suppose, come from. Which was, it was an interesting idea. Again,
I buy that, and I mean, it's very much in line with the first essay, right? Like describing a type of materialism that is like results in feedback loops, or is like requires a level deeper to bring you back to how the mode of production ultimately defines aspects of material social relations. I guess. I mean, there's a point where Pannekoek describes the break almost between Marxism and classical psychoanalysis, in the sense that he for one, he says that like the Freud and the sort of like initial group of thinkers around him were, in essence, like committed to bourgeois society in a lot of respects. Like they weren't revolutionaries in respect to the mode of production, I suppose. And so, I mean, he characterizes the sort of like the two voices in the classical psychoanalyst's head as being one which sort of defaults to like bourgeois idealism, like idealizes bourgeois society, and if that fails them, they usually default to a degree of nihilism kind of thing, which is what a lot of them defaulted to in the face of the rise of fascism to some extent. It's just like, okay, here are the sort of like the base drives of human beings writ large on a societal context, I guess. And clearly we're all just doomed to some extent, because they didn't have this aspect to their theories and their politics which foresaw the possibility of transcending capitalism into another mode of production. Which clearly here is saying that like there is this group of Marxist psychoanalysts who are in the position to like combine the two, and therefore frame what that sort of puts us in the position to do is frame a understanding of the human being on a psychological level, or rather like frame how a Marxist ought to engage mass politics in the context of how do we manipulate or influence popular psychology on an ideological level, which can undermine some of these ideological commitments to capitalism that the working class supposedly have. And it sort of like leads a group of Marxists influenced by psychoanalysis to engage in questions of, okay, how do we sort of like meet societal need on a sort of like desire and on the level of desire, which will allow them to like overcome whatever like unconscious neurotic symptoms they have, which prevent them from becoming fully developed communist citizens. I guess.
Soviet citizens, the perfect human.
I mean, we're back to that. We're back to how do we cultivate the the true human, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, Pannekoek is just so right about this because he's just like, okay, first of all, he's like, Marxists have been doing that forever. He's like, you're not clever, you're not smart
just
for
just
like
because
having
you've like
this idea.
reinvented the workers
Yeah.
like discotheque or something. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, literally. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Whatever. It's interesting though because that is exactly what he's saying, right? He's saying that the psychoanalysts claim that you need to target the superstructure. You need to target everything that's going on other than basically the base mode of production. And again, this is pretty reactionary because it's like they're seeing the defeat. Understandable. They're seeing the defeat of the workers' movement and going, should we try something else? What about if we just kind of fell back on things that weren't like directly related to, the development of society and in terms of its mode of production? I'm going to read the last paragraph of this because it is, I wrote oof right next to it because it was pretty grim. And it was a bit of a gotcha. Pannekoek says the psychoanalysts' proposal practically led to a propaganda of substitute satisfactions for certain impulses which can be supplied within the framework of capitalist society. This political propaganda is not new. It has always been used in the old labor movement. Its fundamental ideas were the basis of the tremendous organizations for singing, hiking, dancing, gymnastic, and all other purposes, except the earnest preparation of fighting capitalism, which nearly all the workers' organizations in Germany engaged in before 1933. However, the real social function of this revolutionary education and its practical achievements became apparent in Hitler's strength through joy, which is pretty fucking brutal, pretty grim. It was so funny. I put this in the Discord and somebody was like, what they say? They were like, God, you can't even go for a hike these days without a left com calling you a Nazi, which I thought was so funny. I was like, respect. That was so good. It was very, very funny. I mean, it's funny, right? We've spoken a bit about this before, about how much we love this idea of making socialist, I don't know, choir groups, socialist hiking groups, socialist allotments, things like that, to really get people engaging socially on a level with other like-minded people and building a movement that isn't necessarily just stuffy politics, right? But it's interesting because it's like, if this stuff is all done under the guise of a mass party, then all of your life is basically being controlled by the mass party. And more to the point, Pannekoek's point here is that those things aren't inherently revolutionary in and of themselves. But I think what's important to note is that he's not necessarily coming out against them. He's not saying like, don't sing, don't have fun. What are you, a fucking Nazi for trying to have fun? He's basically saying those things in and of themselves are not good enough. They might be necessary, but they're not sufficient to building a proper workers' movement. And he's like, what actually is sufficient? Fighting the overthrow of capitalism. Classic Pannekoek right there. You love it. Classic councilist. You love to see it. And I think he's correct. I think he's more or less correct because he is just saying, like the Nazis did this stuff too. There's nothing inherently communist about it. And again, I think it is just, you see shit like this pop up all the time. Whenever Bernie doesn't get elected, whenever anything socialist doesn't happen, people always go, well, maybe we should be doing something else. Maybe we should be doing this. Maybe we should be doing that. And it's always everything other than just, I don't even know what this would look like. And you kind of sound like an asshole for saying it, but like working for the overthrow of capitalism, you know what I mean? So yeah, what are you going to do? Yeah, take that, psychoanalysts. We don't have a response.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like that's quite a scathing critique when he says like, what all that they're doing is engaging with the superstructure of society, and he's sort of criticizing them for not engaging the ultimate base, which is the mode of production, and how do we change it? I mean, I feel like in the end, he seems to go through this process of like acknowledging that like that he seems to be saying that there's something somewhat there is something fundamentally at odds between these two halves. The world of the libidinal and the world of the desirous, which the Marxist informed by psychoanalysis might seek to like try and manipulate. How do we satisfy people's desires in some way? But versus the world of the material, like actually we should just be looking at people's fundamental needs, and the thing which is going to drive them to be revolutionary is a recognition of what their fundamental needs are, and that under circumstances whereby the contradictions of capitalism become apparent, it's that drive toward finding new means to satisfy those needs when this capitalist system has failed us that will be the real driving motivation for the working class. I mean, he comes down to suggesting that like there is something dialectical about that world of the material, which and there's something very undialectical to him about the sort of the world of the desirous. I wouldn't know how to explain the argument that he's making necessarily, but like he seems to be implying that there is like a fundamental contradiction that just can't really be overcome, and the effort to merge these two, not productive on a revolutionary sense, I guess. But.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? Because part of me is always like, I do kind of fall back on, I don't know, maybe just a type of like, what should the class be doing? What should you be doing? What can I be doing right now? And I guess I always do kind of fall back on a kind of super structural like idea of what can be doing, because it's like, what are you going to do? Sit at home podcasting? You know what I mean? Or I don't know, going out and at least attempting to make people's lives materially better. Because realistically, like there are two aspects of a revolutionary's life, right? And I think maybe Pannekoek is being a little bit edging towards one side of that as only being, you know, oh, you should only be working towards the overthrow of capitalism or whatever. But it's like, also, you should just be trying to make people's lives better, because like, you know, this is a moral fight, you know what I mean? And it's like, morally, you should be trying to help people as well. And I suppose that would take the form of some sort of superstructural change, which, again, he's not necessarily against. He's just saying if you actually want to change things, you do need to have this focus on one main thing. But I don't know. I fall back on that a lot of the time, too, is just being like, you know, I don't know. You can write about like what's going on at the Palestine encampments or whatever and try and like explain it in Marxist terms. And you just gotta like bring them some food and like hang out with them. You know what I mean? Which is kind of more so what I've always fallen back on. But maybe I just don't have faith in my ability to change the planet enough. So what are you going to do? I need to read more Pannekoek. Shame.
Yeah, not delusional enough to think that you might be the charismatic leader that us authoritarian personality types might want to follow.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. All right. So I don't know. What do we think? Psychoanalysis. What do we think about this stuff? He seems to basically say necessary but not sufficient. And he also seems to kind of come down on the side of things where it's like, okay, if you take Erich Fromm's perspective of like the social world that you're born into as being this thing that, you know, really is responsible for the development of the child through the conduit of the family, in whatever form that might take, bourgeois family or whatever, then you should just be studying the society itself, and that should kind of be your focus. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, he comes down with a fairly simple prescription, which is to reform the family and revolutionize the kindergarten. That's what he says, right? Like,
yeah, duh, yeah.
I mean, but it is like it is an interesting formulation that I appreciate. That like we allow parents to sort of like fashion their children in their image, and the image that they fashion them in is one which is adapted to surviving under the conditions of capitalism, because that's all that they know how to do, right? And they're sort of like trained to do that. I think there's a well, I was listening to a podcast put out by The Measures Taken recently where they were talking about Alexander Kollontai, and I don't know whether it was a line from her or a line from the ABCs of Communism, where they're just talking, which fundamentally says that like it's part of the communist program to not allow parents to corrupt their children in their own image, which in some ways sounds very like sort of like authoritarian. We're not going to allow parents to pollute. It's very like cultural revolution, right? We're not going to allow parents to pollute the minds of the young with their sort of like regressive bourgeois ideology. I heard it and experienced it another way, which is like, we're not going to let parents pass on their neuroses to their children. which seems fair enough.
Wait, hang on. If kids aren't neurotic though, if they don't get neuroses, they're not going to be communists. What the hell? There's no way that's going to happen. Oh God.
Yeah.
It raises an interesting question about legitimately what the family would look like. Because Pannekoek is very progressive, I suppose, here is basically saying the abolition of the family will just be a fait accompli of communist social relations because you won't need this, reproducing structure that like pollutes people's minds with neuroses or whatever, and develops their superego. But, it raises a question of what it would actually, I mean, to a certain extent, talking about a lot of this stuff is, unless you're talking about this for the purposes of making people's lives better now, it's a little bit hard to talk about because it's like, this stuff's just going to happen. If we got communist social relations, the family's going to be what it's going to fucking be. If all the family winds up being is the Ursula Le Guin dispossessed kids are raised by the community, right? And it's just going to happen. There's not going to be much you can do about it. You're not going to be able to like technocrat your way into not letting neuroses develop onto kids, or there will just be communist neuroses. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I don't know. What are you going to do? Yeah.
Yeah,
man.
Yeah. I don't know. What are we going to do? Ferment a revolution that changes the base of society.
Easy. Thank you, Pannekoek. Done and done. I feel good about podcasting now.
Now we take to our podcaster's armchair and wait for the insurrection.
We shall wait now for the contradictions to heighten. I think I told you this. I was at for the listener, I go to book fairs, radical book fairs every now and then, and I bring communist propaganda. And I was at one in Liverpool for the anarchist book fair or whatever. And this one dude, this like old crusty hippie came up to me, looked at my table, and then looked at me and was like, Mao killed millions of people, right? And I was just like, where on my table are you seeing like anything to support the Chinese Communist Party or Mao? I didn't say, I was just like, oh, wow, yeah, okay, crazy, man. I did know that. That's nuts. That's really bad, in fact. And then he left and he came back and he pointed at me and he just said, read Wilhelm Reich, and then walked away. And I was just like, whoa, I'm not going to do that, but that was crazy.
Yeah. I'm not going to do that, but I would wear a T-shirt that said "Read Wilhelm Reich."
Well, yeah. Picture of an orgone accumulator on the front. Yeah. What are you going to do?
Great. Well,
I Googled Wilhelm Reich today, and I found out about cloud busting, which I thought was just a Kate Bush song, but it's actually a thing that he thought he could do, which is pretty funny.
I have no idea what that is, but maybe
it's
I'll Google
pretty much
Wilhelm
what you
Reich.
think.
Okay, great.
He's like, I can manipulate clouds using orgone energy. Respect.
Okay. Yeah, that guy Wilhelm Reich seems to have gone beyond neurosis into something else.
Tell you what, you want a fucked up read his early life section on his Wikipedia page. Maybe we can cut the guy some slack for orgone accumulation. Yeah. Anyways, all right.
On that note,
yeah. Any more closing thoughts? Psychoanalysis, is this something we want to engage in more or less?
It's the first time. Could we do it less? No.
We've been teasing it for like 118 episodes.
Yeah. Maybe our new state of revolution is Civilization and its Discontents.
Oh my God.
Next week we'll read Civilization and its Discontents.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God. Yeah. Well, hey, maybe we'll get some grad students listening to the show now. We'll hit them with the Lacan hashtag, get them listening, convert them to whatever sect we belong to.
Yeah, there's no room in our sect.
Sect of two. What are you going to do? All right.
Great. Well,
we managed to solve the UK's problems and answer psychoanalytic questions about how useful it is. Wow, great. Look at us.
Sure, I can't solve any of my own neuroses.
Yeah, I was hoping mine would be solved a little bit too. They definitely weren't. If anything, they were made worse because I'm like, what personality type am I? And I'm just going to Google like Facebook quizzes.
Yeah. I can't even remember any of the famous ones.
Yeah. Someone made me do the, I forget what it's called, but it's like the personality test. That's like the 4 letters, right? I forget what I got. I forget really any of it, but I just love things like that. The questions are so funny. They're like Hogwarts quizzes where it's like, what house do you belong in? Are you evil or are you nice? And it's like, oh, I wonder what houses they're talking about there. It's the same thing for the personality test. It's like, do you consider yourself an introvert or an extrovert? And oh, wow, I'm an introvert. Yeah, wow. Oh, yeah. So true. I don't know. Maybe there's truth to them. I just find it very funny. On that note.
Which Friends cast member are you?
And what does that say about your authoritative personality?
Yeah.
Dear. All right. Great. Well, all right. We'll be back next time with something. Maybe at some point here we're going to take a break for a little while.
Yeah.
So maybe that'll be next time. Dan and I haven't talked about it.
We'll let you know through the channels.
Through the secret handshakes. All right. We'll see everybody later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.